This is the William Hill Sports Book Club, where we begin our look at the entries and possible contenders for the 2025 award for William Hill Sports Book of the Year. On this edition, we're reading States of Play, How Sportswashing Took Over Football by Miguel Delaney.
Every single World Cup winning photo in history, it's just the team and the trophy. Whereas in this, Messi has a bisht placed on him by the Emir Qatar.
It's an epic, covering all aspects of the modern game. Over 400 pages of superbly researched detail. Some serious hard work has gone into this book.
What City did was, due to their means that were even greater than a billionaire like Abramovich's, was to basically put in place the perfect structure, and suddenly it just became an obvious choice for him when he was leaving Bayern Munich to go to City.
It's a book that takes a thorough look at football and explains everything that's wrong with it.
It's got power football. You can't reform these states. The opposite happens. These states use football.
States of Play, How Sportswashing Took Over Football is the subject of this edition of the William Hill Sports Book Club. Hi there, I'm Adrian Durham, and so I get to page 435, the penultimate page in this mega book. I've been reading it, I've been getting educated by it, understanding it, kind of reliving moments in the book that happened as well when I was there, questioning my views on the same subjects as well, taking and making notes, as you can see, on what I'm reading, and then the author asks a question. And the question is this: is football at this point a net good for humanity? What a question that is right at the end of the book. Delighted to be joined by the man who posed that question, the author of States of Play, one of football's most intelligent football writers, Miguel Delaney. How you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Congratulations on the book. It is an epic. We'll get into the bones and details of it very shortly. Also with us is Neil Foggy Foggin from William Hill. Reads the books, helps devise the long list, the original long list before the judging panel get involved and break it all up and do their thing. You already want a sequel for this one, don't you?
Yes.
Why?
Because I think there's more to come, isn't there? This story is not going away, and there's more and more to come. Let's see what happens with the City announcements, etc. I just think therell be a second. It's got to be a second book.
Is this why you've written it? Because you know that this is a never-ending story.
Yeah. Can be updated every year. Well, I mean, but you're absolutely right. I mean, to be honest, even in the time since, like in the brief period, even though for a writer it's quite a long period between when I submitted the final draft at the start of August, and then when it came out on the 7th of November, the number of things that happened in that were in that period that were relevant to the book, the City APT case. Obviously, there's the Saudi Arabia World Cup that we've just seen this week. All that's going on with FIFA, UEFA, the new Champions League. There's just, and it also feels like as well. I mean, let's not forget the Independent Football Regulator, which is mentioned in the book a few times, and it has just felt, and I suppose hopefully this is why it was a good time to bring out the book, in that a lot of the forces I talk about in it, and for a while there were all these disparate issues. And I think that this is one of the reasons why I wanted to write it, because I've been covering all these things for years, and I kind of there's something that can link that. There's a narrative that links all this together, really. And I think we're kind of in the real world now. We're seeing that actually, that all of these forces are coming together and really kind of putting football through a time of immense change. And even that question, I suppose, I pose at the end, which is almost a book in itself, maybe. Obviously, football is, in its purest form, in terms of what it is, like there's a great beauty to it. It's brilliant for socially, brilliant for health. There's just the basic joy of bringing people together, the basic joy of kicking a ball against a wall. But obviously, because of that simplicity and how it's spread around the world as a consequence of that has a social power that's been exploited. And you can see the negative side of it and how it's misused, I suppose, in one of the big stories this week, which has been the way the 2030 and 2034 World Cups have been awarded. And ultimately, I wrote the book, I suppose, from someone who loves football and thinks it should be used properly. And in that as well, one of the things I kept thinking about during it, and one of the things that I suppose is a kind of a guiding principle, like if I compare football to even the turn of the millennium, when I was kind of a teenager going into my 20s, and even at that point, it wasn't quite the 90s anymore, but you'd still say Arsenal could go and play Lyon, and it's a tough game. In fact, Lyon beat them well at one point. And Manchester United had difficult games against Dynamo Kiev, against Panathinaikos. And it just, like, obviously people might say some of that is just nostalgia for a lost world, but to me, that's what football should be. It have a vitality and health to it. Where, I mean, because, one of the great beauties of the sport is actually its variety. I mean, look, again, to point to when we go up, or when we grew up, and I suppose this might something that comes up a lot, especially when I was writing it, when I was thinking about it. Like, I grew up, with Subbuteo teams and the colours that would transfix you, like seeing all the different kits, the names on the scoreboard. And that's the kind of what the beauty of the World Cup used to be about as well, opening you up to this other world. And instead, football feels like it's becoming this, as you get closer and closer to the top, and it further and further narrows, but because it has all these forces trying to take it over. And then it kind of becomes a question of, like, I think for a lot of fans who might listen to this, well, why your team can't win, which is basically because of what football has become.
Well, 21 years ago, we had a Champions League final of Porto-Monaco.
Yeah.
And nobody can imagine that now. And there's lots of details on football that we'll get into on this show. In terms of the methodology of the book, there's a few things I want to get out of you here, because, I mean, it is huge, and there's a lot of detail in there that has to be correct as well. So for a start, very quickly, when you've submitted it, and then 3-4 months later it's come out, every day are you thinking, I've got to bring them up, I've got to change this? Is that going through your mind, or can you just leave it?
The initial draft, the first completed draft, I think I submitted that. This should really be etched into my mind, because given how much it consumed me. That was around the 11th of April. And then there was like 3 various stages of editing where my publishers, Orion, and my publisher Tierney, maybe to his great frustration at times, allowed me to make changes. And essentially right up to the 3 months, right up to August when it went through, they let me I remember constantly going, like, the way it worked by that point is I'd have to go into the PDF and actually mark a change I wanted to make. So that happened a lot, yeah.
Wow. It's just what authors go through. I don't think that a lot of people realise that we just read the book and don't think about it. When we go through all of your work as a writer, there's a lot of articles about Man City, FFP, Qatar 2022, all of it really fascinating and revealing stuff, and important stuff as well. It's no surprise that you've written a book like this on sports washing and how it's led to so much that is wrong with the beautiful game of football. There's a great quote from you on page 337 of the book, and it is this: the real emotional core of football is suffering. And that's in a chapter titled Football Without Fans is Nothing. So when was the moment? I mean, that's a big thing to say, and that's the realisation. It's going to hit fans. It's touching fans in a big way. So when was the moment you realised you had to write this book? All of those articles that you've written over the years, all of it has to come together in a book.
It was probably around the Qatar. It was probably around the draw for the Qatar World Cup. Like, it was one of those things. Like, as you say, I have been writing about these issues for like 5-6 years, because my role at the Independent means you kind of have to take these, like, look at football with this sort of scope. We're going to look at these bigger issues. So I was writing about them in kind of a disparate way, and I kept finding that when I was writing about these issues, there were times when you link to something else, and like, I suppose this kind of almost map was forming in my mind. And that did start to become clear in that period. So that draw was April 2022. A lot of similar discussions. It was also on the back of the invasion of Ukraine, which saw Chelsea go close to going to the wall. And I think that's something that's a little bit overlooked now. Just how close one of Europe's, one of the world's great clubs, one of London's great clubs, actually came close to going bust. And while fans obviously have an appreciation for the 19 years of Abramovich, given what they won, to me it's also quite an insane thought to think that a club like that was basically left susceptible to, like, just wider geopolitics, and it was very close to people not being able to do anything about it. And so all of this was kind of swirling around my head. Then I went to Qatar and covered the World Cup. And there was already an idea in my head, but it probably basically, because I knew, and as you can see from the size of it, I knew it was going to be a big task. That was maybe the one thing that was putting me off, just the commitment to it. It probably took someone to just basically go, do you want to do this? So because I had been talking to my agent, David Luxton, about it. And then finally in January, literally just after the Qatar World Cup, Tierney from Orion got in touch wondering would I be interested in doing something. And it was interesting. I pretty much immediately wrote down a structure for the book, which was very close to actually some of the ideas that Tierney had, and is almost identical to what ended up being in the book. So I think and that was actually in trying to plan it out. Actually, that was one of I knew what each chapter would pretty much look like, but the challenge actually, because there's so many beats you have to hit and moments of history you have to hit or themes you have to hit, it was actually which one suits which chapter, and like structuring it so hopefully it's in the right place and makes kind of a narrative sense as much as a historical sense.
You know what? It's fascinating you say that, because when I'm reading it, I'm thinking there's so much information here. The very start where you know it all, it's all in your head or all on paper or whatever on a screen, but it's like herding cats.
Yeah.
How on earth you've made it sound really easy?
Well.
You had a structure, you just popped everything in place. Sounds like a 5-minute job. But
the overall plan I knew what it was going to be, but that some of this, like, and there was stuff like the Super League. I was kind of battling which chapter to put that in, and then there was. Like initially, one of the Man City chapters was all in one, but we decided we had to split that, and it kind of naturally, with the way history has evolved, I suppose, ended up doing much more, say, on the Russian chapter. But yeah, it is. There were a few times I was kind of wrestling myself about what to put where.
I love the introduction is just a few pages long. I think it's important to the book as well, because it's a powerful opening to the book. You talk about in the first page of the introduction, we've got that World Cup final. But then it's kind of hijacked by the Emir of Qatar, who, well, you can describe it for us, exactly what he does with Messi.
Where he basically, I mean, actually, there is one important context here, which is every single World Cup winning photo in history, it's just the team, their own national colours and the trophy. Whereas in this, Messi has a bisht placed on him by the Emir of Qatar. Now, it's important to point out, because actually when I wrote about this at the time, I got a lot of backlash. No one is saying the bisht itself. There's an issue with that. The bisht is like it's an entirely honourable gesture. It's the garment is intended to denote honour. It's an honour to be given one, but you can't separate the giving of it from who gives it, and who gives it is the Emir of Qatar. That inherently makes it a political act, and basically I suppose it's a symbolism of him placing his specific state into this moment of history. And this is one of I suppose one of those realizations you begin to kind of see the real power of this. And I should credit Sam Wallace for this as well, because I think he made the point in one of his pieces for the Telegraph where and that is footnoted. There's a lot of footnotes actually.
Oh, we'll talk about the footnotes, yeah.
But like if you even stand back now, whatever about all the debates around Qatar, and there are many, and they're discussed in the book. Now, like Messi winning the World Cup at last, that's one of the great sporting storylines up there, Ali reclaiming the heavyweight title. And now, in the same way that, say, the Azteca Stadium is associated with Maradona and Pele, well, Qatar, Doha and Lusail are forever associated with Messi and this story. And that is, that's kind of this... That is this historic positive association that no amount of propaganda, black ops, public relations can buy. You only get it through something like football, really.
And I think the great thing about having that at the very start of the book is that everybody knows it, because it was so recent in the memory. And they might have seen it and thought, oh, well, that's a beautiful image. And Messi's won the World Cup. And look, there he's got the World Cup. They're not necessarily thinking about other implications. But in that introduction, very start of the introduction, you're basically saying, well, this is why this book is important. And I'm going to explain a bit more to it. And I think it's incredibly clever writing. That's page 1 of the introduction. Elsewhere in the introduction, you talk about the game being used for questionable purposes. There's a phrase I think you used, dominated by questionable forces as well. And I'd like you to read a paragraph of the introduction for us, Miguel, if you'd be so kind. So it's from the bottom of page 25 of the introduction, and just that paragraph. So take it away.
The story isn't, at its core, sports washing. It is the extreme politicization of football, where the sport has become a terrain for geopolitical positioning that it should really have been protected from. The opposite happened. It has become a pawn for greater interests. Capitalist forces are trying to make as much money as possible out of football. Geopolitical powers are looking to put as much money as possible into it in order to take over football's infrastructure. Many within that are only invested in their own interests, rather than the idea of protecting the game as a whole. This dynamic explains everything about modern football.
I got Miguel to read that because there's some big words in it, okay? And I really didn't fancy that at all. But it is deep. You're telling the reader there that what they're in for with the rest of the book, and there's a lot to come. It's not a Jackie Collins racy novel. This is not Richard Osman and his quaint murder mysteries in an old people's home. This is very, very deep stuff. This is a serious book about football. And ultimately, was that the purpose of the introduction? Miguel, basically to prepare all of us for the 430, 440 odd pages of seriously hardcore football stuff that's to come.
Yeah, and I suppose, I mean, that's why I was actually wrestling with the intro for a while, because I did wonder whether the Messi thing was a bit too immediate, and like whether it tells you enough that's new or kind of grabs attention. But then it just, I think, as you say, why I ended up settling on it is because I thought it was like perfect to show the dynamic here, and then from that you can talk about other issues. But also a key with the intro as well is, I mean, I've said this a few times now, like sports washing is obviously on the cover of the book, but that is almost just the hook. And also, I mean, like the second chapter of the book is about whether the phrase sports washing is even fit for purpose. But also, I mean, like, and I knew this before writing it basically, but I realised that even more as you write it. You can't talk about sports washing taking over football without talking about where football was in terms of the forces already trying to use it, as I say there, and also its structures. And that, I mean, we're speaking on the day after the 2030 and 2034 World Cup votes, well, they're not votes, have taken place, and that's that paragraph I just read out. I think that's a perfect illustration of the issue there. The way, I mean, rather than FIFA is supposed to be the ultimate regulator of the game, the ultimate safeguard of the game, and instead, as all this runs parallel to Gianni Infantino's own burgeoning relationship with Saudi Arabia, they've just given like the greatest event in sport to a state that wants to politically use it. And it's like, even like, it's when I start talking about this, you start kind of jumping around all the different strands and themes of the book. But this absurd defense FIFA has, like their official stance that working with these states brings progress. I mean, the two biggest counter examples of that I go into in the book are the last two World Cups. Russia in 2018, they basically, it is akin to the Berlin Olympics. Putin basically gets to use a World Cup to put on a positive public global face. And everyone was talking about how great Russia was. And I think there's always a distinction to be made between the state and the country and the people. But Putin gets to use that at the same time that he's sharpening plans to increase the invasion into Ukraine, because of course he'd already annexed the Crimea at that point. And also he's engaging in hybrid warfare with the West. Then Qatar, and this is, I suppose, more specific to the point about reform. I mean, any human rights group would say, and I quote a lot of them in the book, that the quote-unquote reforms for Qatar were negligible. They got rid of kafala law in practice. They got rid of kafala law in legal terms, but not in practice. And already those minimal reforms have been rolled back. So, I mean, again, this is a phrase I use in the book, but the tail doesn't wag the dog here. Football doesn't, it's got power, football. It can't reform these states. The opposite happens. These states use football.
So, should I feel guilty that I enjoyed Russia? Because I'm aware that the media, we were in a bubble in Russia. I'm aware we weren't in real Russia. But I'd still enjoyed the tournament. And also Qatar, one of the big problems I had, and you were there as well, one of the big problems I had was, since I've come back, because I go to a lot of football grounds, people ask me, what's my favourite stadium? And actually, I would put Lusail there in isolation. But when I think about how it was built, I mean, I almost feel guilty for having enjoyed the tournament and having enjoyed the stadium. So, but that's not, it's not my fault.
Look,
I didn't make that happen.
Yeah.
And then we all get accused of hypocrisy for going.
Yeah, well, actually, and that is worth addressing, because I've always found that nonsense. I mean, the whole point of journalism is to go and record and actually paint a picture to show what's happening. So it's not to boycott. If you boycott, then it allows a PR or propaganda image to spread. And being there, I think a lot did come out of it. But I mean, your question about Russia as well. That's what I immediately thought of as you said that there was actually the dynamic. I'd say that fans of clubs who support those. Sorry, fans of clubs who've been taken over by states or questionable interests, this whole idea that they should walk away. To be honest, I go into this in the book, I've responded to people on social media with this. My view, fans should never walk away, because fans are actually the true identity of the club. And actually, there's an argument that it's all the more important to sustain that, especially through questionable ownerships. I think it's more not to not enjoy it, because this is a key point. This is our thing that they're trying to take over, and we've got to fight for it. Really, it's more to be, I suppose, aware of the reality. I think that's these things can be nuanced. They don't necessarily have to be black and white binary, despite the obvious morality issues involved.
Yeah, you're not going to fight it or get rid of it by ignoring it.
Yeah.
That's the reality. We're with Miguel Delaney, author of States of Play, How Sportswashing Took Over Football, on this edition of the William Hill Sportsbook Club. This is the William Hill Sportsbook Club. Miguel Delaney's States of Play, How Sportswashing Took Over Football is our book for this episode. And the main man is with us, Neil Foggin from William Hill with us as well. There's fantastic historical context early in the book. It revolves around why football clubs existed, community, etc., formed and grown to help serve people, to help serve communities. There's a history of the European Cup you go into, now the Champions League, the economic importance of the World Cup. There's a lot of really good background that's in there that needs to be in there. Also some incredible stuff like the Bosman ruling. The Man United chairman in the mid-'80s saying small clubs should be put to sleep is an astonishing quote that you found. All that background is needed before we get to chapter 2, which is titled What is Sportswashing? And it's answered brilliantly in one line on the top of page 35. Let me get to it. Sportswashing in this form is the centrally planned political use of sport to normalise autocratic states for the purpose of perpetuating their authoritarian structures without the need for reform. 3 lines and you've absolutely nailed it. But this is what sportswashing is all about. And it's one of the main drivers of the FIFA corruption around Russia and Qatar being allowed to host World Cups. It's one of the reasons why actual states own football clubs in England and France. So let's talk about Man City, right? Your chapter on them is called Flawed Perfection, chapter 9. You say City don't feel as high as the sum of their parts. So they've won all these trophies, but it doesn't feel like it's that spectacular. What exactly do you mean? Why not?
Well, I suppose, look at the central figure who, this iteration of City made such a point of building the entire club around, Pep Guardiola. And they did that because they could. Abramovich wanted Guardiola for years, couldn't get him because he was only going for the man himself. What City did was, due to their means that were even greater than a billionaire like Abramovich's, was to basically put in place the perfect structure, hire all the people that he himself was loyal to, like cheeky Big Sign, and suddenly it just became an obvious choice for him when he was leaving Bayern Munich to go to City. They paid him very well as well, as we know from football leaks, among many other things. But one of the reasons they wanted him, and this actually is one of the themes that I didn't start with, but actually jumped out as I was writing the book. One of the reasons they wanted him was Barcelona 2008-2011. And I think that team is probably, there's an argument over whether it's the best in history. I think it's the most influential in history because that team came at a point where the internet had properly become broadband. So suddenly you're in a world where highlights speed around the world. And like that actually is crucial to a lot of this in the way, like, say, Saki's Milan couldn't. That generates not just global support in the way Ferguson's great Manchester United teams did. The way they played football, it generated this global adulation, this kind of power. And I think they had this aura. They were appointment viewing. There was always kind of the magic of bringing through kind of a young players, Messi, maybe the greatest player of all time. And again, that is this immense social power. And it is as blatant as every single autocrat looked at that and said, well, we want that. Hence, Abramovich, I suppose, as at that point, you could say a representative for the Russian state, given what we know now. Paris Saint-Germain spent years trying to get Messi and look what happened. Look what they did to Barcelona and just essentially almost scuttling the club with the signing of Neymar. And obviously, Abu Dhabi wanted it for Manchester City. They succeeded, but it felt like rather than being anything that was developed organically in a football sense in the way that Barcelona... And I know that phrase actually is one that is almost a bit of a trigger phrase for like City fans, the organic development. And they would point to say, oh, well, Man United or Barcelona, they're wealthy clubs too. That's true, yes. And there is, and the book goes into the issue with the big clubs. But there's still a difference between having this structure and developing, having this decades-long structure and all of the identity of the club and the kind of, and what the club means, and developing a team out of that with basically just seeing what works and buying it. And that's pretty much what Abu Dhabi City did. Because if you think about that whole Barcelona Guardiola thing as well, it's not just actually what they were as a team, it's also the lineage they were part of. That Guardiola, I mean, he reinterpreted Cruyff's football. Like they're part of it, they're probably, like in a purely tactical football sense, probably the most celebrated in history. That line of, and actually Saki's Milan are part of it, but like Cruyff's Ajax in Holland, Saki's Milan, maybe the Ajax of the 90s, and obviously Guardiola's Barcelona. But rather than feel truly part of that lineage, it's like they've just, try to temporarily take it. Would you really put his City team in at the same strand of that?
Okay, there is an issue I've got here, and when I'm reading it, I understand exactly what you're saying. But City was spending big to catch up. Okay, so they had to catch up quick, because they wanted to be able to compete. So my view of it has always been they were spending big to get to a point where they could compete, and the reason why they were then successful repeatedly. But bear in mind they've only won one Champions League, but certainly domestically they've been successful repeatedly, was because Pep Guardiola is so good. His coaching is so good. So they haven't signed Neymar, Mbappe, Messi. They would have known about Mbappe. He killed them for Monaco in the Champions League all those years ago. So they knew about him then. And if it was about signing superstars, then they got it badly wrong. But not until Haaland really did they sign a superstar. So I can understand why City fans will be unhappy about the accusations that it's not organic, because there is City is not just the first team.
No, absolutely. But again, like, look, the structure is based on. I mean, so I think this is why the whole City project is interesting from another perspective as well, and that, well, up until this season, but I think there's other issues with that are actually connected to what we're talking about. It is essentially what happens if you go in, you basically are able to set up a club in the Premier League with almost a blank check. Well, initially, given this is pre the application of financial fair play now, although financial fair play was already in motion. And they basically, I suppose what they did, obviously there was the first few years, they got some of the way there through winning the title with Mancini. But again, that's at the same time as Barcelona are actually the Apple of football, or whatever company you want to compare them to. So they just they bring in all of Barcelona's brains. And there's an interesting thing there. Basically, at that point, Ferran Soriano had done a book. And Ferran Soriano is considered like one of the brightest business brains in football. He'd done a book called The Ball Doesn't Win by Chance, which basically almost outlines his economic philosophy on football. And there is actually criticism for City in it, which is interesting. City, basically, what they were able to do was really just make his book reality. And I suppose, and I think there's a layered debate there. I actually have, the book goes into this, I have complete sympathy with the view that fans of City and multiple other clubs would have, that the big clubs just want it all their own. The traditional, most successful clubs want it all their own way. And it's absolutely true that from their history, and because of the support that comes with that history, they have had this undue power in the game. They've pretty much, almost gerrymandered the system, like you can see it in the Champions League distribution rules, to ensure they're constantly top. And look what's happened in the Champions League now. That needs reform. But the solution to that isn't to just let in states to spend what they want, because suddenly you're letting in a completely bigger problem. And given we've just gone through 7 years where City have subjected English football to a more intense level of domination than we've ever seen, what would it have been like if financial fair play didn't exist? Given if they were spending to the level they were before, when they, were kind of the story in the book, I suppose, about how they gradually went up the table in terms of, first of all, they had to overtake Villa and Everton and Arsenal, so signed all their best players. Then next it was Liverpool, next Man United. They tried to get Rooney. They were willing to spend as much as possible at that point, and these are the means that states have that no one else does. Because this is it. You don't really want football to just become not even which club is the wealthiest. My owner is the wealthiest, especially given what ownership can entail.
No, I don't disagree with that at all. And I think there's another element of it in that FFP didn't exist. Say when Arsenal and Man United were going at it. It didn't exist. So, we'll never know how Arsenal got the money that paid huge wages to Vieira and Campbell when they had a tiny stadium. And I don't really think we should know. I'm not really that bothered about it. What I want to remember is Thierry Henry being absolutely magnificent and Vieira commanding the centre of the park.
There is also an interesting point there. I mean, even though that is this millennium, and it's not that long ago, even at that point, the United-Arsenal rivalry, football's economy was much smaller. And it's why I make such play in the book of Abramovich changing everything. And now obviously it's a completely different sphere to what it was then.
Yeah, no, I think it's a fair point. When you were reading it, Foggy, did you get? Because I wrote a little note that I'll reveal in a second. Did you get the impression that Miguel's not a fan of Pep Guardiola? Did you get that impression?
Not really.
Did you not? Because I got it left me with the impression that you're not a fan. I mean, this is a note that I wrote it's towards the end of the Cirque du Qatar chapter, chapter 8. It says about Barcelona. The debt in 2021 was 1.35 billion euro. You say they've become obsessed with star power. Quote, they symbolise the game's capacity for eating itself. And you say Barcelona and Real Madrid were suffering from the world they created. So my note says, is Miguel insinuating Pep's to blame for the way modern football's gone?
Oh, no. So, although I think in a football sense, you could make that argument. That one is more like the world they created was basically, I mean, like I open the chapter about, one of the first chapters about how football is rife for takeover with Florentino Perez and his stance, which is always that any rule in football is going to be, or he's going to push, so it keeps Madrid at the top no matter what. And Barcelona have been their great rivals, are also sort of Madrid's partners in that way because they both need each other because of the kind of the immense financial power of El Clasico. It's interesting you picked up on that with Guardiola, I suppose. I wouldn't say that. I mean,
well, there was the Catalonia thing as well, and he came out with some very bland statements about Qatar.
I mean, it's that sort of thing. It's a man that's as obviously as intelligent as Guardiola coming out with that comment about Qatar is like, I mean, that deserves criticism. I'm surprised it actually hasn't come up since.
He basically said they have their freedoms within the way states want to run themselves. Yeah.
Which is literally what you could say about North Korea. Like, I mean, it does apply to North Korea or any other autocracy you can think of. I mean, like whether Pep Guardiola is the greatest manager of all time is almost a nebulous argument. Like you can make cases for Ferguson, Steen, whatever. I think it's beyond doubt that we're talking about an all-time genius who is probably actually the most influential manager of all time, and that I don't think any manager has changed how football is played as much as Guardiola. But then, of course, once you get into that, you can... Like, I do make a point in the book, actually, that it's difficult to criticise players, managers and staff for, say, going to clubs with ownerships that we would criticise. I mean, because ultimately that's blaming people, that's blaming individuals for a system and a structure that is out of their control. And like they've got short careers, they have to deal with the reality they're dealt. But there is the question, I suppose, of how they're personally used for sports washing, much as I kind of take issue with the phrase in the book. And like, no one has been as central to any of these projects as Guardiola himself. And I think there are interesting discussions to be had about that.
And it's a great point, and we need to examine that, because there might be people watching this, listening to this, thinking, well, this is just Man City, they play great football, they win stuff, what's the big problem here? The bottom of page 153 of the book turned my blood cold. Briefly, the backdrop is the UAE saw the Qatar-backed Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt as terrorists, a terrorist group. So in his state role, Khaldoon al-Mubarak warned the UK that unless they got involved politically in the situation, the UK will possibly face losing billion-pound arms deals, okay? So let's just take a moment for that to sink in, work out exactly what is being said there. The UK's democratically elected government is being told to get involved in a terrorism situation, potential terrorism situation in the Gulf. Otherwise, the UK stands to lose a gigantic arms deal worth $1 billion, at least. And the person warning the UK government is the chairman of Manchester City Football Club. That's how huge this is. This is what Pep Guardiola and all the players are getting involved in. This is what the fans are getting involved in as well. That's why it's a big deal. So if you imagine that conversation happening, where he's warned the UK, whoever it is, whichever representative of the government it is, he's warned him about that. And the next sentence, the UK government representative is saying, what's Pep like? How heavy is the Premier League trophy? It's absolute madness. The bit I didn't like, really, is, and the bit I don't like, it's not necessarily about the book, but it's the constant questions to Eddie Howe do my head in. Because Eddie Howe, whether rightly or wrongly, is a football man. I know he's employed, but by a state, effectively. Yeah. Although there is the Premier League said there's a separation between PIF and the state, which was denied I think, by the Saudis themselves.
Well, to say, if you want to look at legal documents in the PGA case.
Yeah, absolutely amazing. But I think with Eddie Howe, my problem with this is that he can't be held to account for this because the Premier League have waved it through. So once that's happened, fans, players, coaches have every right to just go ahead and do their job. Surely this is on the Premier League. The Premier League are the only ones who should be grilled about this, not people like Eddie Howe, surely.
Well, maybe grilled, you're possibly right, I think. But I think it's fair to have the discussion with Eddie Howe. He is the representative of the club, and the club has become...
Is the football representative, though? Is there a difference?
Well, there is, because of the way football is used at this point. I mean, these are the kind of complicated questions that have to be wrestled with. And I think also the moment that the book refers to, that came in a very acutely specific week, because it was just after a lot of news had come out about capital punishment in Saudi Arabia, but also it was the first Premier League game that Chelsea had after the invasion of Ukraine, where the future of the club was in doubt, the future of Abramovich's ownership were in doubt. All of this was thrown in there, and suddenly the team they're playing are Newcastle United. I mean, it's pretty I don't in that context at least. I'm not sure journalists would be doing their job properly if it didn't come up.
Well, I mean, the end of the What is Sports Watching chapter focuses on Abramovich and that particular day. He was ousted at Chelsea. Tribalism led to the fans of other clubs, basically wanting Chelsea demoted to non-league, stripped of titles, punished severely. And there was a very human factor that I think got missed by a lot of people. I was at Chelsea Newcastle that day. The game was labelled El Corruptico. In that way, the English have, and it's not just media, I think fans have a way of boiling down human rights issues to a cheap gag. So on page 297, Miguel, you say the entire Abramovich era should have been reassessed. How far back are you going when reassessing clubs? Because I've just said there, a couple of years ago, ahead of that Chelsea-Newcastle game, just said there's a lot of people involved here. There's fans involved here. People who work at the club care about the club. It's the community around the club as well, and everything they do for the community. And you're actually saying that the sport shouldn't have subjected fans to this, i.e. geopolitical issues and sports washing. But then you're saying potentially trophies get taken away. You're saying that the Abramovich era should be reassessed. Is that fair on fans?
Well, I was about to say there, this is the Faustian pact. Fans don't really make that pact. It's unfair to put that on fans. They're in some ways they're victims of the situation as well. And the chapter on fans goes into this.
Like you say, the sport shouldn't have subjected fans to this.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, but again, I think this is one of those questions that actually warrants a layered response, really. Because it doesn't need to be so binary. When I say kind of it should be reassessed, you can't just talk about it in terms of these gushing Chelsea teams anymore, or gushing about Chelsea teams anymore. You have to view it in the reality that was. That is potentially that this was being used by an oligarch he had a very close relationship to Putin. Was it used for some of Putin's intentions? I mean, these are the questions that have been thrown up. Given where the world is now, I think you can't but reassess it in those terms. But that doesn't take away, or that doesn't necessarily contradict the fact that on a purely emotional level, a lot of Chelsea, and I'm friends with a lot of them, a lot of Chelsea fans had the best days of their lives. I was at both of their Champions League victories in 2012 and 2021. That happened. I think the two things can coexist. It's more about, obviously, the initial emotional reaction from fans, obviously, to kind of resist this. But as things sink in over time, I think you can have you can have nuanced views over this. Yes, we enjoyed it, but yes, at the same time, this was the reality behind it.
You know what? I had this so many times reading the book that I'm nodding, I'm agreeing with literally everything you're saying about it, and then I'm thinking as a fan, wow, the football is paramount. So when Alexander Isak, for example, is smashing that ball in the net against Liverpool last week, no Newcastle fans thinking about executions in Saudi Arabia. So that's in the chapter on the fans. I speak to a really good Newcastle fan, Norman Riley, and he's worked in a lot of kind of charities, and he made the great point. He speaks in the book about kind of how he wrestles with it, and how a lot of his friends and family, he actually avoids talking about these issues because it could cause arguments. But he makes exactly the point of when you see someone like Isak running around the wing, it does take you away. But again,
that is the emotional power that these states are buying. Now, people go on about how one of the things with sports washing is you just automatically get an army of fans defending your interests. Weirdly, actually, I don't say when Abu Dhabi or True Mansour bought Man City in 2008, I don't think that's actually what they intended. I think that's become a byproduct that's a bonus, basically. And also, it should always be pointed out, fans who defend these states from criticism, that they're by no means representative of entire fan groups. When you talk to people on the ground, they've often got a lot more nuanced positions.
No, it's fans are clued up on it. A lot of fans are very clued up on it.
But it is, but this is why I do make a point in the book as well, is that for all we're talking about states and kind of the moral position the fans are put in, football shouldn't escape criticism. Like it's even one of the biggest indictments of football is that it actually took states coming in to create a semblance of balance in certain, this is a tough question for the Premier League in that sense, but had Abramovich not come in, would it just been a Man United Arsenal duopoly in the same way we've seen with Barcelona and Real Madrid in Spain? I mean, that's a fair question to have. And the question then for football, I think, should be really, well, how does it reform so you don't need that and we have a more balanced sport?
And I think the other thing about Man City is, and I'm all for scrutinising the ownership, absolutely. No problems with that, otherwise I wouldn't have read the book. But when Mansour took over in 2008, it took over from an owner that was not particularly impressive. It was probably even worse in some respects in Thaksin Shinawatra. And I think that the day he took over, the book says the day he took over, he was charged with corruption in Thailand or something like that. Which is an
he was essentially a fugitive from the state.
Amazing that got waved through by the Premier League. So my big focus is on the Premier League waving these things through, almost like they're not studying it properly. You kind of indicate that in the book as well, that there's not enough goes into the fit and proper persons as it used to be. And that, to me, is the big problem. And who suffers? It's the fans that suffer. Because
it's worth saying as well. So, and this is another uncomfortable truth. Had Mansour not bought Manchester City, the club was in real financial danger. But they weren't unique in that. But over that period, from 2003, really, the Abramovich takeover to then the City takeover, I go through the amount of takeovers that happened in English football, and also a lot of that was because of the kind of the inflation that was caused by the Abramovich takeover, and also the kind of money that started to flood into the sport. A lot of the kind of traditional industrialist owners, and it was this strand of classic English owner in that sense, they just felt they had to sell up because they couldn't compete anymore. And also, that was a particular half decade where a lot of clubs were suffering the problems that Man City were. They were overextended, that they couldn't, wages were going up, but they weren't particularly, or didn't necessarily have the revenue to compete in a game that was being stretched. So again, you return to the question of, well, why hadn't football thought about it? Whereas actually what was happening, rather than football and the Premier League thinking about, well, should we row back here? They actually went all in. They very much share the new Labour outlook at the time, which was any money coming in is good money. That was very much the kind of the Scudamore-led Premier League view. And it's interesting in the context of what's happening now and the hearing, because what is the Manchester City hearing and the APT case nothing if not sport's difficulty with handling powers that are greater than sport.
Yeah.
And I remember, I was talking to someone last week who's, quite a senior figure in the Premier League, as in I'm talking about the Premier League as the 20 clubs, not necessarily the Premier League as a body. And I said, the question was, is there any regret in the Premier League of what they let in, or what their kind of their predecessors let in? Because it's suddenly opened football up to this world of problems and a potential existential situation, at least for the sport as we know it, or football as we know it, in 2025.
We'll return to City a bit later on and exactly what's going to happen. By the way, in the chapter Football Without Fans is Nothing, great chapter, there's a brilliant section on why it's totally pointless trying to discuss all of this on social media. So there are some real light moments in the book, some brilliant moments, and that is one of them. So William Hill Sports Book Club, Miguel Delaney's States of Play, How Sports Washing Took Over Football is our book for this episode. This is the William Hill Sports Book Club. Miguel Delaney's States of Play, How Sportswashing Took Over Football is our book for this episode. Chapter 8, Cirque du Qatar is a superb read. The tension in the Gulf in the build-up to the Qatar World Cup described expertly. Infantino thinking he can bring peace to the area is a laughable moment. It shouldn't be, but it is. This is Infantino, who in the book, page 274, wanted an Israel-Palestine World Cup so he could win a Nobel Prize, as I understand it. I mean, good luck with that, mate. You actually say in the book, Miguel, that the idea could be revived over the next 10 years, that FIFA Infantino might revisit the possibility of an Israel-Palestine World Cup. Are you actually serious? Could that?
Well, I mean, so that is a classic case there. That was true at the moment of publication, or at the moment of editing. Obviously, things have changed since.
Yep.
Now Saudi has it as well.
Probably haven't changed in Infantino's mind.
Well, this is it, yeah. But now Saudi has it as well. You do wonder whether they've got their own self-contained thing. But still, it's like, I mean, like it has been raised in the past, and suddenly, it's as we say, it will be appealing to people, not least. I mean, there is something. So one of another chapter in the book is basically about FIFA and UEFA and the kind of what these confederations look like, and also what that does to people who get to the top of them. And it's an amazing. I mean, the Nobel Prize thing. I mean, this is Blatter's big design. Like, I mean, I opened the chapter on the kind of the road to the Russia-Qatar bids. With like Blatter's big idea was basically, as a child of the Cold War, his plan was Russia 2018, USA 2022, and not just there'd be two events running one into the other, but they'd have actually one organising committee that would work together and a big handshake to symbolise the end of the Cold War, which is kind of like, I mean, given what's happened since, like the
It's mad. Listen, he may well press ahead with it, which will be news. There's no doubt about that. The awarding of World Cup host status to Russia and Qatar was shocking. Lots of people focused on money. Page 104, I'm going to read this quote because it's one of many shocking lines in the book. The hosting of the World Cup wasn't just one with relatively petty bribes, but with trade agreements, arms deals and high politics. From that vantage point, and a lot of hindsight, the decision on 2nd of December 2010 looks anything but improbable. It looks inevitable. I think to a lot of people, we just thought, or a lot of people may have just thought it was about money. And that was all it was. Way more than that. Way bigger than that, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I get look for years that was my impression. You just see the headlines about potential bribery, some of the stories that came out. But then once you start digging into it, and you kind of realize that, I mean, if that's only, and like let's remember, the Department of Justice in the US actually outright made these accusations. They're on record of this. But even all of that is only one part of it. That this and this is, I suppose, what we're really talking about in terms of state involvement and football, not being able to control these elements that are trying to use football. But yeah, like the real story of the build-up to that bid, that infamous day in Zurich, is, all sorts of state deals and the sort of leverage that football can't really deal with. And like the biggest, obviously, being Qatar's gas deal with Russia, to the point, and it was one of those kind of ironic twists of history, not least for Blatter, that in the month before the 2022 World Cup, and obviously at this point Russia is internationally ostracized, they weren't allowed to take part in the tournament. Well, Qatar are actually thanking Putin for his help in basically preparing 2022 at an international summit. And again, that speaks to kind of some of the potentially complicated questions that football may have to deal with over the next few years. I mean, I talk in the book about Abu Dhabi's strong relationship with Russia. I mean, if geopolitics continue to evolve in a certain way, is that going to put football in an even trickier position?
Well, people say that you shouldn't mix sport and politics. Well, it is happening.
Yeah.
You can't avoid it now. Let's talk about the latest World Cup host countries, which we've mentioned before. But 2030, we have 6 countries across 3 continents hosting a World Cup, and the carbon footprint is going to be great. I mean, Qatar was the most eco-friendly man-made event.
Yeah, so I've got the line in the book. I can't remember the scientist's name I used. My apologies. But there's the line about how it's one of the most, the biggest cost in terms of kind of in terms of the climate outside 2 world wars.
Yeah, and I can't imagine that 6 countries, 3 continents is going to be any less than that. And World Cup 2030 will top that. But in terms of Saudi Arabia, There's a line on page 328. Talk of football in Saudi Arabia displaces talk of repression in Saudi Arabia. Amnesty International stated that the regime had already executed 100 people in 2023 by September of that year, was how I read the statement you made in there. So Saudi Arabia hosting a World Cup in 2034. I mean, does this mean 9/11, Khashoggi being murdered? These are just forgotten events.
It's incredible, isn't it? Because even actually, funny, just as you were speaking there, I was actually thinking about this in the writing I did yesterday, and I wrote about something like, ended up being 3,000 words in the whole process of 2030 and 2034. And I think I barely mentioned Khashoggi, which is actually, given the given the reality of that and what it meant and the significance of it, is actually incredible. But it's funny that, like, people talk about, they question whether quote unquote sports washing works. But that's a classic example, actually, in terms of, so obviously what's happening in Newcastle at the moment, there are all these sort of questions over whether the Saudis are fully committed to the club because they can't spend as much as they want, because they've got bigger ambitions elsewhere. PIF deny it, that they're looking to sell. I think they're in it because, or I think they will continue because of Newcastle are in the Premier League. It's a constant generation of money, really. But even if they were thinking of selling, even if they did get out, I was speaking to people in kind of human rights and geopolitics about this, and like the question is, well, was it of benefit to Saudi Arabia? And the answer is absolutely. And for that specific reason, nobody talks about Khashoggi anymore. And like, if you compare the way Newcastle are just sort of if you compare the way the ownership of Newcastle is just normalised now to when the attempt to purchase was actually happening in April 2020 and right through to October 2021, the storm of debate around then, and that's all just dissipated because that's how it works. It's the use of sport to just normalise it. So this is just part of the furniture.
Well, I think with on Khashoggi, bottom of page 306 was another shocking moment. You reveal the bone saw used to dismember him was later revealed to have been brought into Turkey, where he was murdered on a private jet belonging to PIF. Now, if a Newcastle fan can read that and have no emotional reaction to that, I'll be very surprised, I'll be very worried about that individual, to be honest with you. But it's like we said before, when Isak's smashing a ball into the back of the net, who thinks about a murdered journalist? Yeah.
And again, if you want to return to the most rudimentary elements of sports washing, well, as you alluded to there, in the emotion of winning a trophy or a brilliant football moment, well, there's not much kind of psychological space to think about human rights because it is washed away by kind of what you're feeling. Literally
washed away. You're at the spot on. One of the really great things about this book is that it also mentions some of the lesser quoted examples of rule-breaking, FFP, wrongdoing. Leicester, before they won the title, never gets mentioned because of the fairy tale.
And there is a political proximity question with the Leicester ownership as well.
Yeah,
to the Thai state.
There's an element of sports washing. It's obviously to a lesser extent, but there is an element of that. Arsenal having Rwanda on their sleeves, it barely gets mentioned at all. But let's talk about City again. What will happen to City, in your opinion? In the past, the Premier League has accused City of slowing the whole process down. Well, clubs are going to do that. I mean, if you're going to be accused of something, you're not going to speed it up, are you? Does the Premier League really want to damage its own brand? Does it really want multiple champions, Manchester City, to have asterisks next to the titles, to be demoted or have severe points deductions? That damages the Premier League's own brand. And also, the UK government, will they want to annoy the UAE when there's so much money at stake here in terms of deals?
So it's funny because I was having that exact conversation with someone last week, and they... I mean, it's interesting. The current Labour government is maybe considered, and it's ironic we're talking about this, as Starmer has actually been in Saudi Arabia. But I think you only have to look at the greater strength of the football governance bill and the willingness, I suppose, to go further with the independent football regulator. So I think that's maybe less of a worry. And again, you just only have to look at the kind of involvement of the government in the takeover of Newcastle, the kind of the constant messages. From everything I've heard, a lot of which I detail in the book, but obviously it's evolved since then. The hearing has actually gone. It was scheduled to go for 10 weeks. It went to 10 weeks. It's been a disciplined process. So if there were attempts to delay, and we don't know if there are, because that's one thing to be fair with this process as well, so little is leaked out. I think that's because of the stakes involved, and everyone is aware. Everyone involved is aware. So there have been attempts to delay. They haven't worked. As to how it's going to go, look, again, we don't have details of what happened inside. I think there's three issues which potentially point a certain direction. One is almost inarguable. That's that the Premier League's rules, and remember, all the Premier League is a group of members. It's a membership club, so you're in it. You have to sign up to its rules, and those rules demand that if there's an investigation, you have to comply with them. Manchester City have not. This is what they got fined for eventually at the Cass case, and with the Premier League, I suppose, given it's down to 19 other clubs in that sense, the potential punishments for non-compliance alone could be high. It could be very high, given actually what that represents. But there's two other issues, I suppose, the Mancini contract and this detail about, because obviously so much of the case is about whether sponsorship money was actually, ownership money. It's this detail that was actually struck off in Cass because of the different interpretation of the judges about the time statutes, which is that in this deal involving Etisalat, the telecoms company, and obviously ADUG, who at that point were the ultimate, or that was the name of the company who were the ultimate owners of Manchester City, that there was a figure called Jabbar Mohammed involved who was a broker who caused a certain amount of the money to be paid. And as UEFA's own report states, this was never explained. And it is a bit baffling over why, ADUG, who are essentially, they're owned by one of Abu Dhabi's most senior royals, obviously with access to trillions, and Etisalat, also a state company with access to the same trillions, why they would need a broker involved. This was never explained. They didn't have to explain that at Cass because it was struck off due to interpretations of the time statutes. Those statutes don't apply in the Premier League. So it's going to be very interesting to see when the details eventually come out how that plays out. But I think those are the three big issues that potentially point to how this will go.
It's the William Hill Sportsbook Club. It's the William Hill Sportsbook Club. Miguel Delaney's States of Play, How Sportswashing Took Over Football is our book for this episode. Miguel Delaney is with us. And I've got some core beliefs on the subject. Wealthy owners shouldn't be punished for investment is a quote from the book. I absolutely believe that. So if I become a multi-gazillionaire and I want to pump the money into Peterborough United Football Club, please let me see a therapist first, but I should be allowed to do that. I don't see a problem with that. Also, the fact that capitalist owners aren't necessarily brilliant. The Glazers,
Absolutely.
For example, they should come under equal scrutiny. And you do talk about this. Also, Jurgen Klopp, who's been seen as this socialist god in Liverpool for visiting Homebank a few times just outside Anfield, has now sold his football soul to Red Bull, which a lot of people can't believe. So I think it's not just about state ownership or sports washing. Capitalist owners are not particularly great sometimes.
Yeah, ultimately, I suppose, when it came to describing the book after, obviously, again, how sports washing took over football is on the cover, but you can't talk about how sports washing took over without talking about the other side, which is where football is. And that's why when I describe the book now, it's basically I think it's the modern history of how football was transformed by three forces: geopolitics, capitalism in multiple forms, basically the model the game embraced, but also the interests that were also willing to take it over, and its own regulatory failure. The point about wealthy owners and investors is, because this is something you hear so much, yes, you're buying a business, but it's not just a business, it's also a social institution, and that is itself involved in a business that is dependent on competitive games. So once you get into that, if you just allow people to invest whatever they want, you start to and I used a quote in the book, I think I quote Ronan O'Vain from Football Supporters Europe, that once you get into that and there's kind of these mass disparities, well, you are destroying the actual ABC of the business itself. And it's an amazing thing there. So a lot of football at the moment, and a lot of the discussions about PSR, say, and I think there's actually a point worth making there. PSR and financial fair play, they're not the problem, because all they are is cost control mechanisms, and cost control is actually essential to organic sport. The problem is the system they sit in, where some clubs are allowed to earn much more money than other clubs due to football's rules. That's what should be addressed, not cost control. But in all this, there's obviously all these discussions about kind of like American sport ideas, and it's kind of the almost kind of imposing a form of communism on the sport itself. But what is incredible is, at the very root of English football, at the start of the Football League, they realised exactly this, that yes, even though they had all these really kind of progressive rules about how directors couldn't make money out of it, they were still like the clubs actually generated money. And because of that, and because they realised that what the Football League was ultimately, you had to put on competitive games. But there was a core problem. Some clubs were obviously in big cities. Big cities meant big fan bases, and that was pretty much the main source of income at the time. So what was the idea? They shared gate receipts. Now that and again, this is a rule at the very core of English football, at its foundation. And yet that is a rule now that would probably be considered some sort of like American witchcraft, because it's kind of comparable to a lot of NFL ideas. But what did that rule do? That now allied with, I have to admit, and I do go into this in the book, the more problematic issue of wage restraint and the maximum wage for footballers. But it did contribute to a situation where Huddersfield could win 3 titles in a row. Where, the great variety, the great strength of English football was so long was the variety of winners it had, that like Spain didn't have, that Italy didn't really have to the same degree. And that was something that was eroded from essentially the deregulation of football in the 90s and the removal of rules like this.
There'll be people listening to this saying, well, hang on, what about Leicester? Well, we talked before about how there's a backstory to Leicester that isn't particularly desirable. But also, there was a Premier League executive said we don't want too many Leicesters after they've won the title. Yeah. Well, it was actually during, it was the March of that season that comment was made. But also, it's kind of the irony of the Leicester thing as well. People hold it up as this great example to show there's unpredictability in football, where the only reason that story was so good was because the chances were so insane. And like that should be the problem we look at. That should it really be that absurd for a good-sized club with a good support base from a good-sized English city find it daft difficult to win a title? Because that wasn't the case for most of English football history. And it's the fact that we're here, something's gone wrong. And again, I have to say, this is, sorry, I'm getting into it, but that is a motivation in the book as well. I mean, at the start of the chapter on fans, football without fans is nothing, I kind of write about this a day basically at the start of the season. And this was something I have to say was actually inspired by one of my favourite football books, which is Eamon Dunphy's Only a Game, where he talks about a season at Millwall. And he talks about, like, Dunphy starts to go into the idea of how they get to pre-season training, and football was in such a state then that they were thinking, like, right, if we get the one good signing or two, things go well for us, we've got a chance of doing something special this season. Whereas for most fans now, fans of most clubs, that is actually impossible. You pretty much know, because of your wage bill, where you're going to finish. And like tackling that in itself was, to be honest, one of the motivations to do this book. That it's like concern about where football is going in that sense. I have to say there are some great football observations. You talk glowingly about Man United 4, Real Madrid 3, that World Cup final in Lusail we talked about. There's good discussion about Neymar as well, and how sports washing kind of affected his career. The bit about Swedish football is brilliant. Particularly, I went to a Swedish game, Halmstad against Kalmar, a couple of months ago. Absolutely spot on. What an authentic football experience it was. And Neil, it kind of reads like, and it should read, it's a very good read, but it's also a historical reference point, isn't it? It's almost a textbook, isn't it?
Yes, but it's on the right side of being a textbook.
Yeah. I didn't mean it in a bad way.
No. Because the problem is because of the subject matter. It could be very heavy, this. And it is, there's points where I had to go away and take a break from this book and then go back because there's so much information to take in.
It's dense,
but
in a good way, yeah.
But you know, so what keeps you going is that somebody's love and passion for this project comes through on the pages. And I think one of my favourite sections is when you're talking about the Americans.
Yeah.
And the American boardroom meetings where they go, we only discuss 2 things: how much money we're going to make, and how we're going to split it. And it's I find it fascinating from page 1 all the way through.
And we can't wait for the sequels and the updates. Miguel, congratulations again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us on the show. Foggy, a message to authors and publishers is...
Get your books in.
As soon as possible. Otherwise, you can't win it, can you?
No.
It's really that simple. Miguel did it. He's been on the show. States of Play is a really good read. So much in it. It will educate you. That's it for this one. Other episodes are available, including the one with the 2024 winner, Connor Nyland, about his brilliant book, The Racket. The last one we did, the shortlisted My Beautiful Sisters by Khalida Popal. I think we still haven't quite recovered from that episode. It was it had that much impact on us. To listen, go to the Outspoken section of the podcast on the talkSPORT app and scroll down to watch. Search for the William Hill Sports Book Club on the talkSPORT YouTube channel. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you next time on the William Hill Sports Book Club.